Welcome to Intelligence Conversations, where we explore the fascinating world of national security and intelligence with leading experts. In this episode, Neil Bisson, Director of the Global Intelligence Knowledge Network, sits down with Dan Stanton, Director of the National Security Program at the University of Ottawa, and a seasoned professional in Canadian intelligence. Together, they delve into Dan's extraordinary journey from selling shoes in Toronto to a distinguished career in counterintelligence and counterterrorism, as both an intelligence officer and an executive in the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. Dan shares his unique perspective on the challenges faced by intelligence officers versus executives, the critical skills needed for successful intelligence collection, and the realities of working in a human intelligence agency, dispelling common media misconceptions. They also discuss Dan's transition to academia, his work leading the National Security Program, and why topics like tradecraft and insider threats are capturing the interest of professionals and enthusiasts alike. Finally, Dan offers insights into Canada's overarching national security threats, his involvement in the inquiry into foreign interference, and how former intelligence professionals can continue contributing to Canada's national security framework. This episode is a wealth of insights for anyone passionate about intelligence and national security. Let's get started.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Intelligence Conversations. I've got a special guest with me today, Dan Stanton, who is the Director of the National Security at the University of Ottawa for the PDI program. And Dan, you can tell me what the PDI is?
Certainly, Neil. It's Professional Development Institute. Right. Some universities call it continuing studies.
Mm-hmm.
It's not academic per se, even though we have some instructors from academia, but it provides professionals in various capacities, work or personal interest, with a certain understanding of national security, understanding some of the salient issues we deal with today. And we leverage practitioners such as myself in terms of drawing on their experiences to provide these workshops on various subject matter and making it useful for people today.
Now, for my listeners, Dan and I are former colleagues. For some strange reason, as that works in the service, is that we never really crossed paths until after we both retired, which is not unheard of, but somewhat strange because the organization isn't immensely huge. But it just goes to show that when you get a job with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, you could be anywhere in Canada or anywhere in the world. So, that's just kind of the way things happen. But I was fortunate enough to connect with Dan, probably about 3 or 4 years ago now. And he was kind enough to give me an opportunity to go to the University of Ottawa and give a bit of a talk on the psychology of human sources. So that was a great opportunity. So for our listeners, Dan, everyone's tired of hearing me talk about what I did for the service, even though I don't get into too many details, but maybe you can give us a quick and dirty overview of what you've done.
Sure. I'll give you the quick snapshot. I was selling shoes in Toronto up at Yonge and St. Clair, and I was hired into the first class of civilian intelligence officers in CISA. So the organization was just a little over a year old when I got in. And after training, I was assigned to Toronto, and I worked in counterintelligence my first 5 years. So Soviet target, did some counterterrorism work. Most of my career, I would say, was more on counterintelligence than counterterrorism. I also did some counterproliferation. I worked in 3 field offices, Vancouver, Toronto, and finished off in Ottawa region. I worked overseas in various capacities, and naturally, I worked in headquarters. So all roads lead to Ottawa.
That's right, or the mothership, as sometimes we call it, right?
Mothership, the Puzzle Palace, brain trust, whatever we wish to call it. So I had a great career. And as I think people know, CSIS is what's called a human organization, human source. So most of my time was preoccupied with recruiting sources, managing sources, evaluating human sources, and that sort of thing.
Right. Now, you also worked your way up through the ranks a little bit too. So can you talk a little bit about your career progression from starting off as an intelligence officer, then working into supervision, and then up the ranks a little bit?
Yeah. I started as a field investigator, and the plan then was that intelligence officers could do everything. They could do field work, they could recruit sources, they could do case management, they could do analysis, they could
Jack
do
of all
liaison
trades.
work, jack of all trades. And it actually isn't really the case. You know, it's not really possible for people to do all that, but that was sort of the plan. And so I basically did what was there before me, whether it was in headquarters or whether it was in the regions, trying to get as much experience as I could. And then at a point when I was in middle management, trying to get into the executive management, which I did. There never was any real plan. There was no ghost in the machine managing your career. You really had to sort of do it yourself.
Okay.
And sort of maybe observe. I didn't learn how to be a manager. I learned what type of manager I wasn't going to be. You sort of looked at people that really didn't do a good job managing.
Right.
And then you sort of carved out your own, I guess you could say, way of doing things on that. But so for about 13 years, yes, I was what was called an EX in operations in the service.
So how did you find your career from being involved as an intelligence officer, then transitioning into an executive? So did you feel that you were further detached from your investigations? Did you feel like you had a better overview of everything that was happening in the service? What were some of the pros and cons for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I found that there wasn't really much of a transition or a shift. I mean, when I was in EX1, I was actually still handling a source, which was a bit unusual. Yeah, there were reasons for that, and I wasn't in any hurry to give them up. And so I was still involved in that. And then later, even before I retired in operations, I was involved again in some sort of recruitment work. But you do, as a manager, you do lose, you do remove yourself a lot from that, you know, and you get caught up in HR issues, labor relations issues.
Right. The day-to-day things.
Yeah, maybe even a complaint, not against me, but issues that we have to sort out, and so you are kind of removed. And I remember even last few years before I retired, I was in Ottawa Region field office. I remember thinking to myself, "Boy, I've been through half the day here, and I haven't really been dealing much with operations." So it is sort of the nature of the beast. When you do get into a certain level of management, you are kind of removed from it, even if you are in a field office.
Right. So can you talk a little bit about the differences in the challenges that you had as an intelligence officer compared to some of the challenges that you faced as an executive?
Well, I think what I found as an executive was I had more control over my day, more control over what I was doing. Okay. And maybe that sounds elitist, but you're able to sort of, I don't know, you've already got a certain skill set as moving strategically. You understand emotional intelligence. It's not just a cliche. And so you're able to sort of draw on your experiences, whether they're in the field or whether they're in headquarters, to then sometimes get things done. And and then you also, because if I'm going on 20 years service and things like that, you also know a lot of people in the organization, so you can pick up the phone and call someone. CSIS isn't as big as National Defense or these other organizations, or perhaps the RCMP, where chances are you're going to know somebody you're talking to, or you'll know of them, and so you can sort of get things done a little easier. Whereas as a probationary field officer, let's say in Toronto when I started, you don't even have the authority to sign out a car. Right.
You got to look to everybody else to give you a hand.
I can say that on a podcast. It won't get me in trouble. But you're very limited in what you have control over at that working level.
The one thing that you mentioned that really kind of brings me back a little bit, and I think our listeners might get some better understanding of what it's like to work in the intelligence field, especially when you're working humans. you had mentioned the fact that you're reaching out to people on a regular basis to try to get things done. And I think, a lot of people who have a preconceived notion of what intelligence work is all about see it as you're the lone actor, like, Daniel Craig or James Bond, and you're out there and there's your mission and go do it. And it's all up to you. Where in reality, a lot of times with human intelligence, you're reaching out to domestic and international partners. You're talking to different people from different desks. Like a lot of your job is basically getting people on side to help you get done what needs to be done. So having said that, I don't want to go too far into your career because there's a lot of other things that you're doing right now that are just as interesting, but maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the skills that you learned as an intelligence officer working human that kind of transitioned over when you were an executive.
Yeah, it's interesting observation you make. One of my favorite books and movies is Jean Le Carré's The Russia House. And the film was critiqued by a lot of movie reviewers who said it was boring because it was a lot of just people sitting around in rooms, talking, waiting, right? There were no car chases, no shoot-ups and stuff like that. And the reason the film didn't do well at the box office as a spy movie is because it was fairly realistic. Right. Because an awful lot of the work, as you know, you are waiting, you are assessing, you are waiting either for someone to call you back or for someone to respond to some overtures you've made and things like that. And so in that work of human, you're right, it isn't a lone actor out there or James Bond. You are relying on your colleagues to a certain extent because it's you have to respect, need to know, and it's very cloistered. But I, as a junior field officer, I will use the term standing on the shoulders of giants. I was able to avail myself of a lot of experience from the RCP Security Service because they had been at that time when I joined at the top of their game. That the threat environment hadn't changed since the Second World War. They had a very strong skill set, particularly in counterintelligence. And being a bit of an introvert, I did a lot of listening and watching. And so you weren't really out there on your own. You would go back to the office and then you would be talking either to your supervisor or your mentor as to where we think this person's going and where we think this is working. And so you just take that reliance on collaboration and team and just carry it forward. So then when you do get into middle management or you do get into senior management, you still have the similar approach. You might just call someone and say, listen, here we got a situation like this. What do you think? Which I think is actually a good form of decision-making for managers as well. But, it's a people business. Humans is people business, and the organization is like that. It is focused more on the human side than the technological side. So some of those challenges you might have in getting someone, let's say, to begin providing information consensually or facilitating support on something, you may, those certain personality skills or traits you might have, you can then carry that into another domain, which could be in management, in a collaborative sense on that. So I that's why I found, I know it sounds cliche, experience, and you need to have experience in that, but in some ways you do. You get more confidence when you have more experience, and that can carry into certain areas in management, whether it's needing more resources or giving up resources or things like that.
Now, I know from my own personal experience, because I worked with CBSA before I transitioned into the service, I was forced to speak to people all the time. As a border security officer, I had to constantly ask questions, try to figure out what was going on, make assessments on the fly. If I wasn't talking to people at the primary booth, asking them about, why they're coming in and what they're doing or how long they've been away and what they're bringing back, I was talking to people in the secondary area or the office about either, what duties or taxes they're going to have to buy, or if there was some sort of an enforcement action, I'd have to explain it to them. So I think we can both say that when you work in the field of humans, it really is important for you to have those skills. You can be an introvert, of course, but at the same time, you need to kind of put yourself in a position where you can have a conversation with just about anybody for just about anything, because that is what really, helps you succeed in that sort of role. So I mean, I've kind of talked a lot about what you've done while you were with the service, got some great insights, but let's talk about when you retired. So you retired in what year?
2017, late
Okay.
2017. Yeah.
Okay. And then from 2017, when you retired, how long was it until you transitioned into becoming the director of the National Security Program at the University of Ottawa?
So I did for a couple of years. I did contract with CSE, Communication Security Establishment,
Right.
um, for about 2.5 years, and then the contract wasn't renewed at the time of that pandemic you probably heard about.
Yeah, there was something
And
that happened a few years back. Yeah, I
yeah,
remember that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, so but I had already started about 2019. I think it was 2019. Yeah, I taught my first course at the Professional Development Institute, National Security, and so I taught. It was actually Insider Threat was the course. So and then
Oh,
I
okay.
built another course, and it was June. I think it was June 2022. I was asked to stay on as director or to be the director of the program,
Okay.
which is it's a specialty program within PDI,
Hmm.
because PDI has got everything from business to communications to French business, to all sorts of things, a whole spectrum of courses and training. And the national security one was part of these little niche programs that weren't, they weren't things you normally associate with a university. And
Right.
then I brought in a number of instructors. I brought in about 5 or 6 instructors over the last 2 years.
Hmm.
And these are people that have a day job other than
Okay.
that. Just they could be working. In a few cases, they're actually teaching.
Oh,
I've
wow.
got Thomas Juneau with Ottawa University, John Gilmore with Carleton, and others. And so pretty well all are former practitioners from the security intelligence community,
Hmm.
and as well there are some, like I mentioned, who are also academics. And so yeah, it's interesting. It's the reason people take the particular workshop generally is the background of the instructor,
Okay.
because that's really the selling point, is the fact that they've actually done these things. So for example,
Okay.
I have a tradecraft course where
Hmm.
I'll make comments about human source recruitment or surveillance or anti-surveillance, and I'll mention I did do that stuff. I did have training in that,
Right.
to a certain limited sense, because we're limited by the Security of Information Act. But
Hmm.
it's a great program. I'm quite pleased with it. It's fairly successful.
Hmm.
I enjoy it. We have these morning briefs, as you participated in. You
Right.
spoke on the psychology of human sources to a packed room. I remember that very well.
Well, I
Uh,
was lucky to have the right number of people at that time, I guess.
well, yeah, no, they all were there, and it was a success. So we have that. I had a couple of weeks ago. We had from the Coalition of Women Journalists. We had women journalists who were targeted by repressive regimes
Right,
here
which is getting more and more media
in
attention
Ottawa,
now, right?
as it should. And
Right.
that's the whole transnational repression threat,
Hmm.
which is kind of, I call it the dark underbelly of foreign interference.
Right.
Um, and so we bring attention to certain national security issues.
Right.
And then at the same time, there's our course offerings, and there's a certificate if people are so inclined. So
Now
yeah,
for
I enjoy it.
yeah.
I have a lot of fun. I'm too young for power walking in malls, and I find this is a great way to experience my retirement.
Well, I have to say, I really am very impressed by the fact that the University of Ottawa has taken on individuals like yourself with the amount of experience that you have as a
Oh,
practitioner
thanks.
of security and intelligence. Because really, from my standpoint, if I was going to, when I was much younger than I am right now, and I wanted to be involved in the national security or intelligence collection programs within the
Yeah,
government of Canada, this would be the type of thing that I would be interested in. This,
yeah.
and when I was going to university, I mean, criminology, sociology, psychology, that was kind
Mhm.
of the basis. I took policing foundations at the college, and then I moved on to the
Yeah,
university where I took criminology and sociology. But at that time, national security just didn't have the same impact. I
yeah.
think, we're talking early 90s, and the service as a civilian intelligence human collection apparatus had basically just come to the forefront, in the
Yeah.
80s. So, but now, we're seeing it. You can't look at the news, you can't watch the news, you can't pick up, well, no one picks up a newspaper anymore, but you can't go through your feeds anymore without seeing something about what's happening in Canada or around the world that deals with national security or intelligence. So maybe from your own personal perspective with what you've been doing at the PDI program, maybe you can talk about some of the security threats that you're seeing that have emerged over the last, let's say, 5 years that you think are having a major impact on all the Western nations, and maybe you can specify Canada.
Okay, I'd say there's really, I'd say three overall. The first has been, and it sort of started, I think, about 20 years ago, is where there was a considerable shift from what we called state-on-state espionage. That was where the Russians, Chinese, and others were trying to steal classified secrets, trench coats and fedoras, I would call it. And that shifted more towards foreign interference, foreign influence, and of course, cyber. Cyber replaced a lot of the traditional espionage where states are basically hacking in and trying to, ferret out those secrets. So we had that shift, which is significant and has been evolving in what we have today. We still have traditional espionage. You still have the, that MSS spy, trying to get things out of General Electric in the States and things like that. But by and large, a lot of that's been replaced either through cyber or now through foreign influence. And as I like to say, it's harder to steal secrets, but it's a lot easier and smarter to get access to the people that are going to be the future policymakers and have that shift in the direction you want it to shift in it.
Right.
The other is, of course, foreign influence, which has gotten a lot of attention, as it should in Canada, with the election interference. And that hasn't been around for decades. Foreign influence and foreign interference has, but where they've targeted the electoral processes, that's fairly new. And that's fairly significant. We have an inquiry. We can see that. We can see that as a national security threat has even become politicized a little bit. Right. So that is something that we need to do catch up on, Canada as a country. And I think we're going in the right direction, certainly with Bill C-70 in that. The third, and I think it's probably borders more on the existential national security threat, is what we refer to as insider threat.
Right.
And that is where essentially someone has the keys to the kingdom and they can do an awful lot of damage, either through leaking, whether it's a mass leaker or a not mass leaker like a Cameron Ortis, or through a mole, which is a very damaging insider threat. So I would say that is probably one of the more pressing national security threats that we're going to continually be confronted with. There's going to be newer platforms for people to leak on. I'm even thinking out loud here. I gave a workshop, actually, it was last week, on insider threat. And I was thinking when I was going to the university to deliver it, it was the day after the Trump victory was announced. And I was thinking, boy, oh boy, we may have a very disgruntled public service in the United States in a few years as it's being politicized. There'll probably be more whistleblowers and potential insider threats. So it is something I think certainly Western democracies need to get on top of.
Yeah, because I'm not going to dive too far into the insider threat just yet. I wanted to back up a little bit because I do know that you offer a course on the insider threat, and I am going to pick your brain on that. But I want to go back to what you said about foreign interference in the inquiry. Now, for those of you who don't know, Dan has actually been a part of the inquiry. He sat in on some of this, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about what your role is, who you were representative of, and what you were doing involved with the Hogue Commission.
Certainly. Thanks, Neil. So I gave some testimony at two of the House committees on foreign interference in 2023. And then I did I was doing some media interviews on the whole issue. And I actually publicly said at the second committee to the Prime Minister please reconsider your decision not to have an inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
And it was picked up. A reporter then the next day in a scrum said that to the prime minister. And then he said, well, we didn't ask Dan to be the expert. And then that was picked up by a couple of radio stations.
Mm-hmm.
And so lo and behold, I ended up in the inquiry. But what I basically did was I wanted to be involved. I wanted to get involved.
Right.
But I needed to have an organization. I couldn't just go as Dan. So I went to the Pillar Society, which is retired CSIS and retired RCMP Security Service.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a member of their board. And so at the board meeting, I said, here's an opportunity. I said, I'll represent you. Pillar Society can get standing, both phases of the inquiry, and we can, for the first time, contribute to potentially new national security policies and law, which we've been grumbling about for years.
Right.
So anyway, had a number of Zoom meetings and back and forths and what we would be doing. And part of it was, do we go from being a retirement society to a retirement society with a bit of advocacy?
Mm-hmm.
And we went to the latter. And so then I applied, I filled out all the forms and wrote this long narrative about how we would have something to bring to it, and help the inquiry, basically help the inquiry. And the commissioner, in her response, she accepted it. And she said that I would believe that the Pillar Society might have a position or opinions that are different from CSIS.
Right.
And for that reason, she granted it. Which is true. We're not just an apologist for CSIS. I've sometimes even been critical of them. Mm-hmm. So we participated. I was doing most of it in phase one and then in phase two on the policy side. And we're done now. The commissioner is going to have her report, I think, the first week of December on it. Mm-hmm. And I think it was a good process. I dealt exclusively with about 3 or 4 people on the board. We kept it limited, need to know. So if I was submitting something, at least I had their backing. If they're not going to read it on a web page and say, what does Stanton think he's doing? Mm-hmm. So I had their endorsement of what we were suggesting. And in the back behind the scenes, I was dealing with, I guess, some of the legal counsel on things. If they asked a question, well, what does this mean? What is a disruptive power? I would say, well, this is what it is.
Right. Now, I have to say this to you, Dan, I'm very impressed by the fact that you have basically, I don't want to say single-handedly, but part of the reason why we have transitioned from the David Johnston 1 or 2 page report on what he thought, there is no reason to be concerned about foreign interference and we could just move on, to the Hogue inquiry, is because individuals like yourself, who are former practitioners and are still involved in the national security, I want to say program, from the perspective of you're still helping others understand what's happening when it comes to national security in Canada.
Yeah.
So
thank you.
I want to compliment you on that. And at the same time, I also want to use that as an emphasis, without putting too fine of a point on it, is that there is a place for those individuals who have previously worked in national security and intelligence collections to still offer in society. A lot of times with the Pillar Society or with other organizations where you did a job for so many years, thank you, here's your gold watch, go enjoy your retirement, go play with your grandkids, all that other kind of stuff, and just forget everything else. We don't need you anymore. I think it really does go to show that they do, because when you work for an organization like the Canadian Security Intelligence Services or Communication Security Establishment, you are limited in what you can talk about. You are not a person that can go out there and say, you know what, we need to do this. This is important. This is important. You are a government employee and you are bound by the oaths that you've made in relationship to the Security of Information Act. So now, luckily, we never stray too far into anything that we have to worry about when we talk about those things, but we still have the opportunity to share that our previous knowledge and experience to help those who don't have that knowledge and experience make an informed decision. Yeah. So I think that's one of the great things about your opportunity to sit on that commission or be a part of that inquiry. So that's amazing.
Well, thank you, Neil. I think what part of it is what we want to do, and I use we. I'm talking Pillar Society. I'm including yourself, others that speak, even whether you're speaking in the media, any other forum, is we want to demystify national security. We want to get away from its previous I guess you could say, incarnation, where it was things you can't talk about and
Right.
things that was mysterious and wrapped in a riddle and all those cliches.
The
But
enigma.
by talking about it, by getting the media, by talking to reporters, I've spoken to reporters who didn't even quote me, and I didn't want to be quoted, but I was just explaining how the legislation worked. I'm explaining Section 2B of the CSIS Act. And
Right.
it's not necessarily rocket science, and it's certainly not some religious or religious mystery, but it's just to sort of bring it down into concrete sense that people can understand. And I think people do that. We're doing this on the road with, I've got 3 colleagues from the Pillar Society. We're going to Toronto to speak on the 20th. And it stemmed from a panel we had at CSIS with the Intelligence History Conference. It was on the 4th of October.
Right.
And there was 5 of us. I was the chair, and the 4 of them were speaking about their experiences in the RCMP security service and in the early days of CSIS. And it was just wonderful to see, because, they part of the message was, hey, we have a lot of experience here.
Right.
I think part of the message was to CSIS as well. We have a lot of insight here, and we know sometimes what didn't work.
Right.
And rather than just have that all packed up and put away in a box on a shelf somewhere, ask us some questions. If there's something you want to know, maybe we've had the same conundrum or the same challenges, maybe with less technology to rely on. So
Right.
I think you could extrapolate that really into any profession. I think there are people that that finish and they're proud of the organization, they're proud of the work they did, but they also like to, in a way, want to be remembered and want to be remembered for the work they did in a certain capacity.
Right.
So that's why we're trying a bit more of that through either this type of sort of informal, 4 people on a panel thing, to media interviews, to even the program at U Ottawa, is to just try to sort of exploit, if that's the right verb, the knowledge and insight.
And from my personal experience, I mean, I've had the opportunity, much like yourself, to speak in the media about
That's
different
right.
decisions that are being made and different things that are happening from national security or an intelligence collection perspective. And I think I think there might be a bit of a fear out there that, well, they're going to be critical of us. They're like former malcontents who are critical of us because of this or because of that. But from my personal perspective, I haven't seen that in the media. What I've seen is there are a lot of people out there that want to inform the public, want to give them an opportunity to make a decision, but it's not about criticism of decisions that are being made by the service. I mean, the service is a government department. They're run, their mandate is to provide information to the government so that the government can make decisions when it comes to national security threats. Now, there have been times that, you may be critical of the way the government handled it, but my biggest concern has always been the amount of emphasis that's put into resources and funding for national security. Instead of looking at it as, okay, well, we don't really have to worry about these things, it's not that big of an issue, to what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years, where a lot of issues that have happened within the federal government have been about national security and intelligence. So I think that individuals like ourselves that are out there talking about this type of thing and trying to advocate for more attention towards national security and intelligence, I think it can only lead to a better understanding for all Canadians about what's happening and how they're affected by it, as opposed to, oh, well, you know what, I'm critical of this, they should have done that. Why don't they? Like, no one's trying to be an armchair quarterback. I think a lot of us are basically just trying to make sure that people have a better understanding of what the service is all about, and kind of demystifying, like you said, what national security and intelligence is all about. It's not the James Bond, it's not the fast cars, it's not the cocktails and the tuxedos. It's a lot more about just going out there, talking to people, getting the information that you need, and trying to prevent bad things from happening.
Yeah. I think a lot of it is the lack of an intelligence culture. It's not really a problem with CSIS or CSE or anything else. It's just within the government historically. Well, Canada has not developed an intelligence culture, and you see that coming out of the inquiry. You see that where there's a perception of threat activity described as diplomacy,
Hmm.
What do we do with these assessments? Did anyone read it? Do we act on it? All those issues. I don't want to belabor it, but
Hmm.
at the heart of it is a little bit governance, and a lot of it is intelligence culture. And I think if there's a silver lining through all this interference,
Hmm.
Chinese, Indian, it's a long list,
Hmm.
is we are going to perhaps begin to develop that intelligence culture,
Good.
with the, the legislative support, the resources that it's needed. But if you
Hmm.
don't have that as a foundation, you can throw money all over the place. It's not going to
Right.
improve Canada's national security.
Right. So I want to go back a little bit because you were talking about one of the major concerns that you have when it comes to national security and, over the last 5 years and probably going into the future, the near and probably, far future,
Yeah.
was insider threat. Now you do a course on insider threat, and
Yeah.
you and I have had conversations off mic about some of the interesting issues that are plaguing other Western countries when it comes to insider threat. So maybe, we've got about 6 minutes left here. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the course, about some of the things that, are introduced in the course, and maybe some of the more relevant issues that are happening just over the last little while when it comes to insider threat.
Sure. I mean, I've done a couple of speaking engagements on it. One was in Toronto, and I've done some in Ottawa. And what it really is, Neil, is that the insider threat, where people are willingly
Hmm.
leaking information or providing it to another intelligence service, there seems to have been on the increase. And there's a myth I'd like to sort of shatter. And the myth
Okay.
is that you've got all these foreign intelligence services that are just running rampant over the country trying to recruit people,
Hmm.
Russians, Chinese, and so on. And the actual fact is it's not happening.
Right.
The 90% of the insider threats are what we call walk-ins,
Hmm.
or volunteers, as sometimes it's referred to in the media, is that people that for various reasons, often psychological, they
Hmm.
decide to compile information, load it on keys, disks for months on end, and then find a market for it,
Right.
either in a foreign intelligence service or a WikiLeaks or an Assange, and share the world, or a Cameron Ortis sending it to a gangster and then offering it up to some money launderers. And so that is going to be, whether it's the public sector or the private sector, is going to continue to be probably a daunting threat,
Hmm.
because not only does the insider threat cripple the organization in terms of its ability to operate, it also weakens the brand of the
Right.
organization
Right.
and the inability to keep things secret. There are reasons that governments need to keep things secret. We have to
Hmm.
accept that if we're going to discuss insider threat. And
Right.
the same with the private sector. Shareholders are going to want some sense that the company can keep their secret sauce and
Hmm.
not, do sharesies with the whole world. But we're
Right.
getting more and more people feeling isolated, estranged, various, I guess, reactions to things, external drivers, and they may be predisposed to do the leaking or provide information to a foreign intelligence service. Notwithstanding genuine whistleblowers, we're always going to have whistleblowers who are
Hmm.
important. If they're actually blowing the whistle,
Right.
that's important. If it's,
Hmm.
something illegal or government malfeasance, we need to have those avenues open.
Right.
But
But there's a big difference between like a Watergate situation and,
yeah,
let's say, um, Edward Snowden, who just feels that, he needs to have a
yes,
platform so that, and risking national security at such a high level. So
yeah.
there definitely is a balance, right?
It is. And then sometimes it depends on your point of view. And Watergate's a good example because Deep Throat, his name was Mark Felt.
Hmm.
I mean, he was seen as this heroic guy on a white horse because he leaked to Woodward and Bernstein about the FBI's investigation of the cover-up of Nixon's cover-up, which is
Right.
pretty easy. It's pretty black and white. But then you
Hmm.
scrape the surface a little bit. He was acting director of the FBI after Hoover was finally retired, and he
Hmm.
was even going out and getting the curtains for the office because he was going to be the director of the FBI.
Right. Right.
Nixon brought Patrick Gray in instead, and that
Hmm.
didn't sit well with Mark.
Hmm.
So his motivation was largely personal
Right.
and career. It just so happened it was Nixon and his advisors that were doing the cover up and the whole story. But I raise that because sometimes it's tough you can go either way on some, like Chelsea Manning, you can,
Right.
even to a certain degree, Snowden.
Mm-hmm.
It can depend on your point of view. Although I do have in my course a way where we can determine whether it's an insider threat or a whistleblower.
There you
But
go.
sometimes people are very divided on, what is a whistleblower and what is, just a leaker.
Right.
For various reasons. We see this in the Canadian context.
I was just going to say that segues really well into foreign interference and how it got leaked to the media, and how basically,
Absolutely.
if it wasn't for that leak to the media about foreign interference, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about you being on the inquiry and all the other things, right? Like it would just be another, so there are probably a lot of people in Canadian society would say that whoever was or whoever were involved in the leaking of that information to the media may have done.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Intelligence Conversations. Neil Bisson, Director of the Global Intelligence Knowledge Network, and his guest, Dan Stanton, Director of the National Security Program at the University of Ottawa, have provided valuable insights into the intricate world of intelligence, national security, and the challenges facing Canada today. For more discussions on intelligence and national security, be sure to follow Neil's other podcasts. Global Intelligence Weekly Wrap-Up, where he analyzes major security stories from around the globe, and Spies Like Us, co-hosted with Al Tredenick and Phil Gursky, exploring pressing issues within Canada's intelligence community. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with others who are passionate about all aspects of intelligence collection and national security. Until next time, stay informed and engaged because intelligence matters.